With all the tutorials on lighting and cinematography, I find that one that gets overlooked is going to be how to accommodate for different skin tones. Now, as somebody that's magnificently melanated, and I also have a lot of talent and clients that are the same, dialing in my lighting is going to be that much more important, especially when I want to bring in a look. So in today's video, we're going to be talking about how to light cinematic interviews for people with darker skin tones. Let's talk about it. Now, the first thing we want to pay attention is actually going to be our camera's positioning. Now, right now we're doing a straight on talking head video, so obviously I'm not going to have it on a 45-degree angle, but our camera is generally going to be a 45-degree angle from our face. And right now, if you haven't noticed, I'm between a window and I'm between a wall. Now, if you want to put your subject in front of a window and point your camera towards them, what might end up happening, depending on the type of day, especially when you don't have diffusion in front of your window, is you're going to have harsh lights and even harsher shadows. And those things you just can't get rid of in post. They're not going to look good, and especially on darker skin tones, it's going to bring up imperfections that you might not want. Now, on the flip side, you could put your subject in front of a wall and you could shoot from there as well, but you want to make sure that you don't have windows in the back of your frame, at least ones that don't take up the majority of the frame. The reason being is because you're either going to need incredibly powerful lights or you're going to have to deal with blown out windows, which never looks professional, and most cinematographers and professionals never actually want that. So in this scenario, this is great for me because I'm between a window, I'm between a wall, and you know how the rest of the song goes. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is, of course, going to be our light. Now, obviously, we're going to have a key light because most of the time we do have a key light, but the important thing about this is that we have to get something that's bicolor. Now, the lights that I'm going to be using is going to be the Amaranth 200X. They're bicolor lights that go down to 2700 Kelvin, right up to 6000 plus, and they're going to be great, especially when you want to bring up different skin tones. Because darker skin tones still fall within that orange on the color wheel, you want to be able to bring those up by using your lighting. Actually bring down the temperature a couple of Kelvin from the balance that's going to be in my camera. For example, right now I'm shooting at about 5200 Kelvin in camera, but my key light, my Amaranth 200X, is actually set to a 4500 Kelvin, which is going to be a little bit warmer, which is going to help bring up the tones coming from my face. Now, on the flip side and onto my left, I really want to pop myself off of the background. When working with darker skin tones, because obviously they're going to be darker, it blends into the shadows a little bit more and it removes a lot of that three-dimensional look that you want to really pop your subject off the background. So I'm going to use another Amaranth 200X that's going to be in a diagonal line from my key light. That way you're going to have some light that's coming on the left side of my face and off of my shoulder, and that way even if I'm wearing a black shirt, it still looks like I'm coming off the background a little bit. Now, this is also going to be set to 4500 Kelvin as well. What I also want to do is I want to make sure that it's about half the power of what I would on my key light. That way it doesn't look too blown out, overbearing, or a little bit too sourcey. Now, next thing we're going to be talking about is going to be neg, and by neg, I mean negative fill. Now, generally speaking, black surfaces soak up light and create shadows. So if you notice, there's a lot of contrast on this side of my face. It's a lot darker than this side, and that's because right beside me is going to be a big black board that's soaking up all the light that would have been bouncing off my light to the wall and back onto my face. Now, I did find a couple of V-flats in the studio, so these aren't mine, but this is an example of what it looks like when I have neg on my face. And I'm going to show you what ends up happening when I go the opposite way and I start to use a bounce. Now, obviously, this looks a little bit different because instead of where the shadow is, there's definitely light coming onto the side of my face. Now, this is actually bouncing off the slightly warmer light that's on my right, coming from the board that's on this side and returning back onto my face. That way, I'm going to have a nice even tone. There's not as much drama and contrast, which actually may make for a flattering look. Now, those aren't hard and fast rules. In fact, they're just kind of things that I do instinctively. In one situation, it's a little bit more inviting and a little bit more friendly, so I'll go with a bounce. And on the other end, I don't know, some dudes like looking badass, but to each their own. If you want to create more contrast and drama, use negative fill. If you want more even tone and a flattering look, by all means, use a bounce board. Now, we're going to move a little bit away from some of our lighting. We're going to move over into our camera, more particularly the lens. Now, for me personally, I like having some sort of a diffusion filter almost at all times, especially when working with subjects in interview scenarios. So I am going to be using a 1/8 glimmer glass to help take off some of the digital edge that I might find on some of my autofocusing lenses like the G20mm that I'm using right now. Now, there is another concept called filter stacking, which you might not heard a lot about, and generally speaking, it's self-explanatory. I could actually stack one filter onto my diffusion filter in order to really bring in a look. If you haven't noticed, on the front of a lot of your filters, there's still a thread on the front, so you can actually mount on more than one filter to really create a look that you're looking for. Now, I'm not going to put on another diffusion filter or an ND. I'm actually going to be using a circular polarizer. Now, circular polarizers, the main function of them is to take out unwanted reflection from pieces of glass or any other reflective surface. However, when you're lighting a subject with darker skin, what ends up happening is you might have a couple of highlights that might go a little bit into the overexposure. But because you're working with darker skin, if you try to adjust for it, you might actually end up underexposing the rest of the person's face. The circular polarizers actually help remedy that because it brings back some of those highlights that get lost in your key light or your rim light or whatever lighting you're going to be using. That way what ends up happening is that the information that might be lost in the highlights from my lighting gets brought back in, and it gives me a nice and even tone. And I look a little bit less plasticky, a little bit less like glass, because a lot of that reflection that's coming off the light that otherwise is just giving me exposure to my face is brought back in to bring in all that detail. Now, the setup is actually pretty much done. However, we do have a sun that's coming through the window and it's moving around throughout me recording this video. So one thing that I want to do is actually just use diffusion in order to block that off and bring down some of that exposure. Now, the 5-in-1 diffusers are actually incredibly easy to find, and they're incredibly affordable as well. And you're going to have a diffusion that's going to be on the inside of that package, and all you have to do is just hang it off of the C-stand and put it in front of the light, or at least in front of the window where the sun is going to be coming from. That way I'm going to take out the harsh highlight that the sun might get, especially when it's going to be moving around if you have longer shoots. That's just another tip that you can use in order to bring down some things and have more control over your situation. However, I do like using diffusion with the sun because even though I like the light coming in, I want to have a little bit more control and avoid harshness, especially on people with darker skin tones. Now, that being said, those are all the basics if you want to shoot cinematic interviews with people that are magnificently melanated. However, you might not have the perfect scenario. You might not have the bright sun that's coming in or the studio or all of the lights. However, there are still things that you could take away in your run and gun style of shooting. You don't necessarily need lights or C-stands or anything to use filter stacking, which is going to give you your diffusion, and it's also going to bring in your highlights when working with subjects with darker skin. On top of that, using a 5-in-1 reflector is fairly affordable and fairly easy to use, so you can always do things like bouncing light or diffusing light, especially when you're in run and gun situations, because it doesn't need much setup. And if you're somebody that only has daylight balanced light, you could actually go into your camera and you could just cheat your white balance up a little bit. In fact, I was on a project a couple of weeks ago and I only had my Nan Light 4 as a 300. And it's a 5500 Kelvin balance, and I only have that daylight balanced look, especially on my subject's skin. So all I did was I just took my white balance on my camera, I brought it up a little bit, and it brought out a lot of those warmer tones while still lighting my subject at the same time. It's just a little hack that you can use, and don't go overboard with it. However, when you're working with darker skin tones, there's a couple of tweaks and a couple of different things you have to adjust in order to make sure that things are dialed in and look the way that you want.
Now here's a pro tip if you don't have control over your lighting, and that's going to be picking the right time of day. Whether you're shooting outside or inside, making sure that you're picking the right time and the position of the sun is going to drastically improve your lighting for darker skin tones. Now generally speaking, for me, I don't like shooting at high noon, and I try to keep things to sunrise or close to sunset, and if I'm in an indoor location, I have a little bit more leeway. However, whether or not you're going to be shooting indoors, outdoors, golden hour, or dawn, basically what you want to do is use the position of the sun to your advantage to make sure that you're getting the best exposure on your skin.
That being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, or the very least that you guys learned something, but I do suggest if you want to learn more about exposing for dark skin tones to begin with, you can check out this video right over here. That being said, see you guys in the next one. Peace.